This video is about ATP, and ATP is the molecule that cells use for energy. Photosynthesis produces glucose. Glucose is a reactant in cellular respiration, and cellular respiration produces ATP. So the process of cellular respiration breaks glucose down into ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate. And ATP is what cells use for energy. In the bottom left, we have a chloroplast. The chloroplast is where photosynthesis takes place. And the point of photosynthesis is to produce glucose. Glucose is then used by the mitochondria in the process of cellular respiration. So cellular respiration takes place in the mitochondria. And the point of cellular respiration is to produce ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which the cell will then use for energy. In the bottom right, we have a plant cell, and here we have the chloroplasts in the plant cell. That's where photosynthesis takes place. Photosynthesis produces glucose, and the mitochondria are going to use that glucose to produce ATP to power the cell's activity. But at some point, an animal might come along and eat this plant, and the glucose and the other carbohydrates in the plant, which will be broken down into glucose by the animal, the glucose from the plant is then going to be delivered to the mitochondria of the animal cell. And here we have the mitochondria of the animal cell. And ATP will be produced by the animal cell using the glucose that it got from the plant. Some examples of cellular processes that are powered by ATP are active transport, glycolysis, and muscle contraction. These are just three examples of activities that are powered by ATP, adenosine triphosphate. In this image down here, first off, we have a cell membrane. And then we have, let's just look at the little black circles. These are our sodium ions. So we have sodium ions more highly concentrated outside of the cell membrane than inside. Notice there's 4 sodium ions inside the cell. There are 6 outside of the cell. If we look in the next image, the cell has moved 3 of those sodium ions from the inside to the outside. We only have 1 left. Well, the process of moving those sodium ions is called active transport. We've talked about that before. Things naturally move from places of high concentration to low concentration. If the cell had no control over the movement of the sodium ions, they would have flowed into the cell because they were more highly concentrated outside than inside. But the cell didn't allow that to happen, and it actually took some of the sodium ions from the area of low concentration inside the cell and moved them into the area of high concentration outside the cell. Again, we call that active transport, and we've said active transport requires energy on the part of the cell. Well, now we know what that source of energy is. It's ATP. So ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is what powers this process of active transport. There are 3 ways that cells produce ATP: glycolysis, fermentation, and cellular respiration. Glycolysis and fermentation take place in the cytoplasm. Glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm. Fermentation takes place in the cytoplasm. And when we say cytoplasm, what we mean here is it doesn't take place inside of an organelle. Cellular respiration takes place in the mitochondria. So here we have our mitochondria. This is an animal cell where we have our mitochondria. That's where cellular respiration takes place. Glycolysis and fermentation don't take place in the mitochondria. They take place outside of it. As we've noted before, aerobic processes take place in the presence of oxygen. In other words, aerobic processes require oxygen. Anaerobic processes do not require oxygen. They take place in the absence of oxygen. That prefix "an" it means without or lacking. So anaerobic means not aerobic. Glycolysis and fermentation are anaerobic, or not aerobic. So glycolysis and fermentation do not require oxygen. Cellular respiration is aerobic. It requires oxygen. Cellular respiration produces way more ATP than glycolysis or fermentation. As we've noted before, aerobic cellular respiration is going to produce way more ATP than anaerobic cellular respiration. So glycolysis and fermentation, they produce some ATP, but they don't produce nearly as much as cellular respiration, which uses oxygen. Let's look at some MCAS questions. In the first step of glycolysis, glucose is converted to glucose 6-phosphate. Which of the following supplies the energy for the reaction? Well, we didn't talk about glucose 6-phosphate, but you don't really need to know about it to answer this question. We're talking about supplying energy for a chemical reaction in a cell. The answer is A. ATP is what cells use for energy. Which of the following happens when a phosphate-phosphate bond in an ATP molecule is broken? We didn't go into the details of how ATP is used for energy, but you can figure the answer to this out anyway. We have A, energy is released in the cell. We have B, light energy is absorbed in a plant cell. C, water is transported into an animal cell. Or D, lysosome contents are released in the cell. Well, ATP is all about energy. It's what cells use for energy. So the answer is A, energy is released in a cell. I know B is also about energy, but it's obviously about photosynthesis. Light energy is absorbed in a plant cell. It's absorbed by the chlorophyll inside the chloroplasts in order to get photosynthesis going. During exercise, a person's muscles need a constant supply of ATP. To meet this need, the rate of which of the following processes increases? Well, which of these processes produces ATP, adenosine triphosphate? The answer is A. Cellular respiration is the process that produces ATP, although we noted glycolysis and fermentation also produce ATP. What directly supplies the energy needed to actively transport sodium ions across the plasma membrane of a cell? We're talking about energy being used by a cell, so the answer is A, ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Also, we specifically talked about active transport. Active transport is one of the cellular processes that is powered by ATP. One other thing. What directly supplies the energy? Remember, ATP comes from glucose. Glucose is broken down into ATP. So it would be correct to say that cells use glucose as a fuel source. Cells use glucose for energy. It's just that they break that glucose down into ATP. So how do you speak about this difference between using glucose versus ATP or using carbohydrates versus ATP? Well, the way that the MCAS asks this question is, what directly supplies the energy? Cells don't use glucose directly for energy. They break it down into ATP. So ATP is what cells use directly for energy. This video was about ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate is what's used by cells to fuel such activities as active transport, glycolysis, and muscle contraction. And glycolysis, fermentation, and cellular respiration are three processes used by cells to produce ATP. Glycolysis and fermentation take place in the cytoplasm. Cellular respiration takes place in mitochondria. And glycolysis and fermentation are anaerobic, meaning they don't use oxygen, whereas cellular respiration is aerobic, meaning it does use oxygen.